Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Centre of Islamic Studies seminar at the University of Cambridge. My name is Paul Anderson. I'm the acting director of the Centre for this year, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to actually the first talk of this term, first public talk of this term. And I'm particularly delighted to welcome Dr. Glenn Robinson. Dr. Robinson is on the faculty at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California, and is affiliated with the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at the University of California in Berkeley. He served as an expert advisor both to US aid and to the US Department of Defense on various development and political challenges facing the Middle East. Prior to that, he was a Fulbright scholar at the University of Jordan and has also served as a visiting professor at the National University of Singapore and at the University of Otago in New Zealand. Dr. Robinson has authored or co-authored 4 books on Middle East politics, as well as dozens of journal articles and chapters and papers. And his most recent book is entitled Global Jihad, A Brief History. This was published last year with Stanford University Press. And this is also the title of Dr. Robinson's talk. So Dr. Robinson, we're delighted to welcome you here, and thanks very much for coming.
Paul, thank you for those very kind words of introduction, and as well for the opportunity to chat with the Cambridge community about the book, some of the ideas in the book, and certainly would look forward to getting feedback and criticism, what have you. So I look forward to the discussion. I do have slides, so I'm going to share the screen now and bring up those slides. Hopefully you can all see them now. So in this talk, I will be making two broad arguments. You can see them on your screen. One is specific to global jihad itself. This is a phenomenon that's only been around since the 1980s. And I make the argument that there really have been 4 distinct iterations of global jihad, as distinct from the local jihadi groups that were beginning to proliferate in the 1970s in the Middle East. That there have been 4 specific types or iterations, call them waves, of global jihad over the course of the last 4 decades, and each having pretty distinct causes and pretty distinct ideological formulations for the way ahead. What unites them all is that they're global in orientation. They see a problem in the international system, so it's a systemic crisis and not just a local, we need to change this regime problem that the large majority, or kick out somebody that's occupying a chunk of our land, which most jihadi groups up to this point have been characterized by. So four distinct waves, and I'll spend the first 20 minutes or so talking about each of those 4 distinct waves and what made them distinct. And then in the book and in this talk, I then raise the question, well, how does this global jihad movement fit into the larger universe of violent political movements over the last century? How do we sort of understand it? And here I make a novel argument that it's a variant form of what I call a movement of rage. It's a phrase that belongs to Ken Jowett initially, but I steal his phrase and build on it, and I think make an interesting contribution in terms of how to understand this kind of distinct form of political violence. So we'll get to that in the second part today. All right, so oops. In the book, and I won't spend time here since I think all of you are pretty familiar with it, but I do give some background that the global jihad movement did not just emerge out of the thin blue sky, that it has had predecessors, building blocks to get there, and 2 building blocks in particular have been important. One is the rise of political Islam, Islamism, different names in English to describe it. Here you see a picture at the top of Hassan al-Banna, who's the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the sort of preeminent, still to this day, the preeminent organizational version of political Islam or Islamism. I do make the point that Islamism has been primarily nonviolent. I don't want to push that too far because it has engaged at various times in various places in violence, political violence. But my point here is that violence is not critical to the Islamist program. It is required from time to time in their view, but is not a sort of a foundational characteristic of Islamism. That is what separates it out from jihadism. And again, we see jihadism rise, and I get into the first chapter of why that's the case, in the 1960s and 1970s. And this is local jihad groups. And for them, violence was critical. It was the only means that could sort of break the logjam and push forward an Islamist political agenda. So violence became this critical distinguisher between Islamism and jihadism. And then that third step along the way is what I'm looking at in this book is global jihadism, which again only rises in the 1980s for reasons we'll get into. And as I said, with four distinct waves moving forward. Excuse me. So let's get right into it. The first wave that I go over is the wave that is focused on liberating occupied land. So again, it's a very territorial focused ideology, and it's very much an outcome of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December of 1979. And so that was the specific crisis, was the Soviet invasion and occupation of Afghanistan. But for some of the thinkers on the jihadi side, and in particular, I draw your attention to a very famous jihadi, Abdullah Yusuf Azzam. You see his picture here. Imam al-Jihad, as he's often called, the preacher of jihad. And he was one of the chief popularizers of the Afghan jihad. He traveled around the world. He came to the United States on at least 2 occasions, went to Europe, went to the Arab world regularly to try and raise awareness and funding for the Afghan jihad. He was a prolific author, and a lot of what he has written, wrote it in Arabic, of course, but a lot of it, what he has written has been translated into English, including Defense of Muslim Lands and Join the Caravan, his 2 most important works. So he becomes the chief ideologue for this first wave, which is sort of the Afghan wave, if you will, during the 1980s. Okay. So what were his big ideas? Why do I and a lot of other people refer to him as the father of global jihad? I look at 4, and discuss in detail in the book, 4 ideological innovations that Abdullah Azzam made that really founded then the first wave of global jihad. And the 4 you see on your screen here, it's that second one, the Jihadi International, al-Qa'ida, which is not the real translation of al-Qa'ida is the solid base or the solid foundation. But what he had in mind was much more of a Jihadi International. So I'll get to that in just one moment. So the first ideological innovation is, as you all know, armed jihad. And when jihadi ideologues are talking about jihad, they mean jihad as-sayf, the jihad of the sword, not jihad nafs, the personal betterment jihad. They all raise it, all the ideologues raise it to the second most important obligation on Muslims after Iman, after faith itself, the Shahada. But depending on the ideologue, there is a twist. So for Abdullah Azzam, that twist was jihad, but not just any old armed jihad, but armed jihad in defense of Muslim lands. So again, a very strong territorial emphasis. And you can just see the Afghan model liberating the Afghanistan from this foreign infidel invader and occupier, then clearly colors his mind about what is the sort of larger international problem. Because he looks around and says, look, there are other forms of Afghanistan in the world, other occupied Muslim lands, and what he means by Muslim lands are historically Muslim lands, and many that still have a predominantly Muslim population. So after Afghanistan, Palestine was next, very clearly in his mind for liberation. But again, a dozen other places in Central Asia, which the Central Asian republics were then under Moscow's rule, Kashmir, Mindanao, and other occupied lands. So how to liberate them? And this is where he takes this concept, this very interesting concept that basically all jihadi ideologues, was a very common concept in the 1980s in Afghanistan, this concept of al-Qa'ida al-Sulba, the solid base or solid foundation. It was meant by everybody, including Azzam early on, to mean territory, and specifically to mean Afghanistan. And that is after Afghanistan would be liberated from the Soviets, and a proper Islamic state put into place in Afghanistan, that would then be a solid base or solid foundation to expand out from there, to take the project globally after the liberation of Afghanistan. In the last 2 years of his life, and the only place he really wrote about it is in this journal on jihad that you see in the upper right-hand corner. He wrote an article that was in fact entitled al-Qa'ida al-Sulba. And he makes this interesting transition in his understanding of the meaning of it, not as a territorial base, but as a warrior class, as the creation of a pious warrior Muslim class, again, of pious fighters that would travel the world and assist local Muslim populations in liberating their territory, right? So that Afghan model taken to places around the globe. I refer to this as this idea of the Jihadi International because it's essentially the same concept of the old Communist International, the Comintern, in which sort of a vanguard of communists would travel around Europe primarily and assist local populations to liberate themselves from bourgeois domination. So obviously a class-based analysis with the old Leninist Communist International, and a sort of a different idea, but the same general concept for Azzam in terms of liberating Muslim territory. So this was his main, I think his kind of main concept and the main notion of that first wave of global jihad. Azzam had other contributions. The two here, again, I detail in the book. One is providing a coherent explanation to a concept that had been sort of hanging around ever since Sayyid Qutb in the 1960s, which is to understand jihad as-sayf, armed jihad, jihad of the sword, as a permanent revolution. Again, sort of drawing on I'm drawing on the old Trotsky language of revolution, of permanent revolution. Sayyid Qutb never gave a really coherent explanation as to why he said this jihad was armed jihad was a permanent state of affairs. It was daima, it was always to be there. Other than that, there was a very long laundry list of things to do. Azzam gave it a coherence when he linked it to the concept of Tawheed, which of course is normally translated as monotheism or the oneness of God. But for Salafi and Salafi jihadis like Azzam, it has a much grander notion of the awesomeness of God, of the one God, that the awesomeness of this one God in everything. And it was through armed jihad, and I don't have time to go into the details, but it was through armed jihad that one could fully realize Tawheed in sort of all of its awesomeness in the old-fashioned sense of the word. So again, another interesting ideological innovation. And the other, not necessarily a good innovation at all, was the cult of martyrdom that we often associate with jihadi groups today, that simply wasn't there prior to Abdullah Azzam. I'll introduce a book in just a minute, written in 1979 by an Egyptian jihadi, very famous Egyptian jihadi, that doesn't talk about martyrdom at all. It's just not. It's not part of the sort of jihadi world at that point. The striving for martyrdom in a way that we see it very commonly in jihadi groups today. More than any single person, Abdullah Azzam was responsible for that, for giving the intellectual architecture to a cult of martyrdom. He had a doctorate from Al-Azhar in Cairo, which gave him sort of the credibility, the academic chops to write about that, and he did, and he's had this enormous impact ever since. All right, so that's the first wave briefly. The first wave ends when Azzam is killed in 1989, a few months after the Soviets withdraw. And his idea is, this Jihadi International idea is presented to the Saudis by this man that you see, Osama bin Laden, after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in August of 1990, where bin Laden takes the Azzam model, the Jihadi International model, and says to the Saudis, let me do this. Let's liberate Kuwait in this way. I will raise 100,000 mujahideen, and we will undertake the liberation of Kuwait in that manner. Don't bring in the Americans and their infidel allies. The Saudis rejected that, and that first wave essentially went into the history books at that point. The second wave, the America First wave, the far enemy wave, if you want, then begins with bin Laden in the mid-1990s. And again, it has both a specific or set of specific crises and a more generalized crisis that bin Laden talks about. The specific crises were the defeat of and the weakening of jihadi movements around the Middle East in the first half of the 1990s, when before then they were on the rise. They were sort of winning their battles. But in Egypt and Algeria in particular, the low intensity conflict in Egypt and the hot, nasty civil war in Algeria, what looked like likely Islamist jihadi victories in the early 90s, by the mid-90s, it was very clear that they were going to be defeated, and the so-called apostate regimes in Cairo and Algiers would prevail. At the same time, of course, beginning in the fall of 1990, you saw the first permanent American military footprint in the Gulf region on the Arabian Peninsula, and its expansion throughout the 1990s, not just in Kuwait and in Saudi Arabia, but in Qatar and Bahrain, in the UAE and elsewhere. And bin Laden then links these kind of local problems of the 1990s with a general problem that he looks at, which is the durability of apostate regimes. So think of the difference now between that first wave and the second wave. The first wave was about territory, about liberating territory, occupied Muslim territory. The second wave is about driving the Americans out of the Holy Land, out of Arabia, out of the Middle East, and even more broadly, the Muslim world, in order to make the local regimes, local apostate regimes, vulnerable to overthrow. So those losses in Egypt and Algeria and elsewhere could be turned into victories in the future. In the book, I do some detailed analysis of two, I think, very important documents that show the sort of evolution of bin Laden's thinking, how he became a global jihadi in a way that he was not in the 1980s. One is this 1996 declaration of war. It's not a fatwa. It's sometimes erroneously called a fatwa. It was not. It was actually a speech that he gave in the Hindu Kush when he first arrived in Afghanistan in 1996. It was recorded and then put down in paper, transliterated and translated. There are debates of how much the translations have, or the transliterations have omitted from the original oral speech. But anyway, this was a declaration of war. 1 foot in the global jihad camp, 1 foot in the Takfiri local jihad camp, declaration of war against the United States, but also again against their accomplices in Riyadh, according to bin Laden. The relations between bin Laden and the Saudi state had deteriorated, and by 1994 they had totally broken over issues of Yemen and other things. And then in 1998, actually less than 2 years later, bin Laden, as one of a handful of authors, issues a fatwa. And of course, bin Laden did not have the religious credentials to issue a fatwa, but there he was as first author, using the name Sheikh Osama bin Mohammed bin Laden. And he got a lot of pushback, incidentally, and to my knowledge, he never again used that phrasing going forward. You see that in Quds al-Arabi newspaper, and the top, for those of you that read Arabic, here's the announcement of that fatwa that bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri, Rafah Taha, who's another Egyptian jihadi, Yeftun, issue a fatwa to kill Americans fi kul makan, in any place, anywhere in the world. So this was a call for mass murder. So let's get into bin Laden's ideological innovations, one that I just mentioned. And again, in an overall program of driving the Americans out of the region and weakening the apostate regimes so that they could be more easily overthrown. Bin Laden does the same thing Azzam does, says jihad is the second most important duty for all Muslims, armed jihad, after Iman, after faith itself. But he phrases it not in a territorial way, but as you can read here, pushing the American enemy out of the Holy Land. That is the armed jihad he has in mind. So a couple other innovations of Azzam that are interesting. One is, and I think the thing he's most famous for, is taking this concept that had been around since 1979, 1980, of a far enemy, near enemy, right? This is not an old concept. It dates to this fellow you see on the screen, Muhammad Abdus-Salam Faraj, an Egyptian, or Farag, if you will, an Egyptian jihadi who was one of the main planners of the assassination of Anwar Sadat in Egypt, and ultimately he was hanged for that. He wrote a short book to fellow jihadis. You see the cover of it in front of you, Al-Farida al-Ghaiba, the hidden obligation, or the missing duty, the absent duty. Has been translated in different ways. Farida just means duty or obligation. Al-Ghaiba is actually the term that Shia used for the 12th Imam in occultation. So the missing Imam. So the duty that hasn't been implemented, which for Faraj was armed jihad. And he specifically warned his fellow jihadis not to spend time trying to deal with a far enemy, which for Faraj was Israel, and instead spend the resources that you have focusing on the near enemy, that is the local apostate regime for Faraj, the one in Cairo, of Anwar Sadat at the time. Bin Laden took that concept and turned it on its head and said, essentially, Faraj was wrong. We have to focus on the far enemy first, because without pushing the far enemy out of, which is the United States now, not Israel, without pushing the far enemy out of the region, the near enemy will always be sustained by the far enemy. So we have to break that chain and make the near enemy vulnerable after we have pushed the far enemy out of the region. And the other obligation that I've mentioned is this fard ayn, the sort of the highest level of obligation for any Muslim in the world to kill Americans and their allies, military and civilian, anywhere you find them in the world. So this is, again, a very radical concept of mass murder, quite obviously. All right. That second wave almost done by around 2003 or so, about the time of the US invasion, but it carries on a bit, and I think one can talk about its demise with the killing of bin Laden by US Navy SEALs in 2011 in Pakistan. But by that point, there was already a third wave. This is the ISIS wave, or the Caliphate wave. Also having specific crises that launch it, and a general crisis as well. The specific crises, the first one was the destruction of the Iraqi state in 2003, in which the forebears, it went through name changes on several occasions, but the forebears of what we then called ISIS basically entered led by this man you see here in the middle of your screen, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, entered the fray. He was a Jordanian from Zarqa, but he entered the fray with his small group that had been training even before the 2003 invasion. And it's that group that ultimately evolves into what is ISIS. It didn't go very well for ISIS in Iraq initially, but the Syrian civil war in March of 2011 and the essential abandonment of the Euphrates River Valley and much of eastern Syria by the Syrian regime, withdrawing not all, but most of its military from these areas, allowed ISIS to be reborn essentially and to regather its strength. For ISIS, the issue wasn't apostate regimes, the issue was apostasy itself, sinful behavior itself. How do you go about trying to end apostasy and allow Muslims to live a fully pious life? This was the sort of the big animating question, and this is now what gets into the state building concept, that in order to eliminate apostasy, you have to build a pure Islamic state based on the Sharia, where the sinful temptation is not even part of the scene. So again, compared to the first two iterations, liberating territory in the first wave, driving the Americans out of the region in the second wave to make local regimes more vulnerable. This is the state building wave that is concerned with living a pious Muslim life under Sharia. This third wave is far bigger than the first two waves. I put key ideologues, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi and Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who is the self-declared caliph here you see him in Mosul declaring himself as caliph in 2014. There are a lot of documents. I spend some time especially focusing on a 2004 book. And 2003 to 2005, this 3-year period was a period of enormous ferment in jihadi circles and a lot of production of documents, and some of the most sort of radical and violent documents ever produced by jihadis. And one of them was this management of savagery by the pseudonym. It was an Egyptian jihadi, but the pseudonym of Abu Bakr al-Naji. So again, some of the innovations, ideological innovations for ISIS. So ISIS was about state building designed to banish apostasy. And it's not just creating a new state in the 21st century, but creating a pre-Westphalian state. So going back to, prior to the Treaty of Westphalia, which, as you know, the primarily Germanic states of Europe, agreed to disagree, right? They sort of built in rules of the game, how states should treat each other. And that Westphalian concept informs the international system to this very day. ISIS did not subscribe to that Westphalian formula. They wanted to create and did try and create a pre-Westphalian state. Again, a lot of innovations with such a large movement. Just go over some of them very briefly. One is just the declaration of the Caliphate itself. Nobody else had done that. This was part of what I call down below jihadi cool, that ISIS had the guts to actually declare a caliphate. Other people had talked about that, but had never done it. So that was an innovation. The way they used violence, and here you see the book Idarat al-Tawahush, literally the management or administration of savagery. This was essentially a blueprint for how ISIS used violence while it was trying to come to power, and then after it did come to power in northwest Iraq and eastern Syria. And again, the focus on gory performative violence that would both take lands out of regime control and put them in a gray zone. And then once you capture those lands and declare your state, the use of the same kind of gory performative violence as a means of social control until such point as you actually have the administrative and institutional wherewithal to compel social conformity. Very apocalyptic ideology. There are a couple of books that have been written on the apocalyptic nature of the ISIS or neo-millenarian nature of ISIS ideology, sort of end times. So I won't get into that here. I talk about the sort of the victory of storytelling over theology and the way ISIS sort of broadcast its message. Extreme sectarianism, much more sectarian than the first two waves of global jihad. And then something I spend a fair amount of time on in the book is going over this concept, what I call jihadi cool, what old anarchists used to refer to as the propaganda of the deed. The sort of Nike just do it mentality of not spending a lot of time in theological argumentation with the ulama around the world, and ISIS basically spent very little time trying to convince the ulama of the rightness of its cause, and very few ulama, in fact, no leading member of the Muslim clergy recognized this caliphate. So there was a big divide between the traditional clergy and ISIS. They were more interested in that propaganda of the deed, of just doing gory, cool stuff that would repel a lot of people, but would attract primarily young Muslim men looking for excitement and meaning in their lives, because those are the people they wanted most of all to recruit to their side. So anyway, I go into all of these ideological innovations. I date the end of the ISIS era. ISIS is still around as a very deadly jihadi group, but it has lost its territory. It's lost its territorial state, which was its sort of value added in the jihadi community. It's lost its territorial caliphate and has become essentially just another, although a very large jihadi group out there. All right. So the current wave that we are in now, the Jihad Fardi, the personal jihad, or as it's come into English, leaderless jihad, began at almost the same time as the third wave, but for very different reasons and with a very different ideological formulation for moving ahead. The destruction of the Emirate of Afghanistan in late 2001, after the events of September 11th, 2001 in the United States, was really the thing that kicked it off. And I would also suggest that this fourth wave got another sort of boost with the destruction of the ISIS Caliphate as well. The general question, particularly after the destruction of the Emirate of Afghanistan, the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, was the larger looming defeat of the global jihad movement, at least according to this fellow that you see in the upper right-hand corner, Abu Musab Asuri. He wrote this 1,600-page book you see in the lower right-hand corner, Da'wat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya al-Alamiyya, the global Islamic resistance call that he wrote while in hiding in primarily Pakistan in 2004, 2005. When it was published online, he was then subsequently captured by Pakistani forces, turned over to the Americans, and it's not clear what came of him since. I suspect very strongly that he was rendered to Syria and executed there, but that's just speculation. All right, so this fourth, the Jihad Fardi, is again something that we're in now, and I suspect we will be in for many years to come. It's a strategy that was designed to survive dark days for the global jihad movement. You can summarize, in fact, Abu Musab al-Suri used this phrase, Nizam la Tanzim, quite a bit. So system, not organization. Organizations can be defeated. They can be rounded up. You can capture a few members, torture them, get the names and addresses of everybody else, and in short order defeat that organization. But creating a system that is not dependent on organizations can guarantee, Asuri thought, survival, at least until there are better days and one can think about territory again. So he describes, and others have added to this description after Suri had disappeared in 2005, he describes a network system that is very much reliant on modern media forms, internet, social media, etc. Again, the three issues that I go into in some detail. One is Jihad Fardi, this concept of personal jihad. Also what I call a wiki narrative, and that is this fourth wave does not rely on one or two or three ideologues. It is a community of ideologues, again, using social media and the internet to continuously construct and reconstruct a narrative, what I call a wiki narrative, that then can incorporate new acts of violence stitch it into this larger fabric, this larger narrative of global jihad. And the emphasis Suri puts on violence and gore, particularly against civilian targets. He is not shy about saying, embracing the word terrorism, and sure, that's what we do. If you want to define it that way, fine. The type of violence, typically terrorism, but not always, but the type of violence that the fourth wave utilizes is also utilized by white nationalists and others. It's very much a 21st century form of violence, which is often referred to as stochastic terror. So this is inspired violence that gets called for and implemented by essentially random individuals that are really difficult to predict who will be, sort of who will act upon the call to violence. Some people will, so it's probabilistic that there will be a rise in violence, but it's very difficult, if not impossible, to see which individuals, without any ties to the mothership, to a mother group, ISIS or al-Qa'ida or anybody else, which individual will be inspired to get in their truck and run down as many pedestrians as they can find, for example. This form of stochastic terror, again, it's a pretty durable form of violence. It's not a big, huge existential threat, but it is very, very difficult to stamp out in its entirety. So that is going to be with us, I think, for a long time. So let me just take just 5 minutes here, the last 5 minutes, to talk about where does this global jihad phenomenon of the last 4 years fit into the larger universe of violent political movements. And I go over in the book that the vast majority of political movements that use violence over the last century are all coming out of some version of the Enlightenment. Leninism, the scientific advance of history, all of the sort of national liberation movements in the post-colonial period, post-World War II period mostly, emphasizing freedom and liberty. And even I would argue that elements of fascism, the sort of the making the trains run on time, modernization elements of fascism, also can be grouped, maybe uncomfortably, but grouped into the sort of broader Enlightenment type of political movements. But there have been a handful of others, both religious and secular, that do not fit into this Enlightenment form of political, the ideology to justify this kind of violence. And it has a particular kind of sociology, which I also get into in the book as well. So I argued that this is a distinctive form, that global jihad and these other groups, non or anti-enlightenment groups, are a distinctive form of violence, what I call, again, borrowing from Ken Jowett, a movement of rage. And movements of rage are defined by two primary characteristics. One is nihilistic violence, and I mean nihilistic in the political, not the philosophical sense. So it's not meaningless violence, but in the political sense of root and branch, over the top, system destroying violence. And an apocalyptic anti-enlightenment ideology. Very clearly not in an enlightenment type of category. I coined the term gnocicide because all of these groups attack gnosis from the Greek of knowledge, side, the Latin meaning the killing of. So the killing of knowledge, or the killing of those with knowledge. This seems to be a pretty common form or pretty common characteristic within movements of rage, to attack the most educated elements of your population. So you saw that in, I think, sort of the exemplar of a movement of rage, the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, where when they came to power in the mid-70s, they emptied their capital city, Phnom Penh, of its inhabitants. The most well-educated strata of the population was executed, either directly or sent out into the killing fields, as they came to be called, to die out there. Other examples of movements of rage, I argue, include the Red Guards in China that occurred actually a decade before the Khmer Rouge, Boko Haram in Nigeria before it sort of found global jihad, the Brownshirts in Germany as part of the Nazi coalition, not the entire Nazi coalition, but elements, and the Brownshirts in particular constituted a movement of rage. And I also argue in the book that many elements of the white nationalism or white supremacist movements today in the United States and elsewhere are forms of movements of rage as well. And I argue then that global jihad is a variant form of a movement of rage. It has that call for nihilistic violence. It has that apocalyptic ideology. It has that element of cultural contamination and calls for gnocicide. It's a variant form in the sense that the ideology and violence are situated at the global level and not at the national level, as all these other movements of rage that I just mentioned are very much at a national level. And with that, I will stop and turn the floor back over to Paul. And again, to thank you all for taking the time to listen to some of my thoughts. And I look forward to your feedback. And with that, I will stop my screen share.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Dr. Robinson, for a really streamlined and fascinating attempt to bring these rather complex, diverse trends into an overarching paradigm that's rather clear and easy to grasp.